appreciate this opportunity to share with you a few reflections about the new Saint John Paul II, or I prefer to say John Paul the Great. And it was my privilege to meet him as Pope 5 times for a one-on-one conversation, and to see him and interact with him in groups many more times than that. But actually the first time I saw him was when he was the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, and he came to the United States in 1976. While here in the United States in 1976, it was summertime, I was doing courses in Boston at Harvard, and he came to give a lecture at Harvard on a rather esoteric philosophical question. And the dusty lecture hall at Harvard where he spoke seated about 300 people, and perhaps there were 100 who came to listen to this obscure Polish cardinal talk about an abstract concepts in phenomenology and philosophy. And so I was there and was quite intrigued by his philosophical depth and his command of the English language. At the end of the lecture, several of the Harvard faculty that were present surrounded him with further questions, and I noticed that the Cardinal Archbishop of Boston, very humble Humberto Cardinal Medeiros, was off to the side and nobody was paying any attention to him. So I forsook my opportunity to speak to Cardinal Wojtyła at all and went over and chatted with Cardinal Medeiros. And so when 2 years later Wojtyła was elected Supreme Pontiff, Holy Father, I said to myself, well, James, you missed your chance to talk to a pope there. Your one and only chance. You went and talked to his fellow cardinal. Well, I didn't regret it. I loved Cardinal Medeiros, and I had heard the full lecture and was duly impressed by Cardinal Wojtyła. But as divine providence would have it, I had the opportunity to meet him in 1982 at the Mass for the Canonization of our Conventual Franciscan Saint Maximilian Kolbe, the martyr of Auschwitz. And because I'd been involved in the cause promoting Father Maximilian Kolbe as a future saint, when the day of the canonization arrived, I was invited to be one of the 20 people in the offertory procession of the Mass of Canonization. And I carried up this large portrait of the newly canonized Saint Maximilian and presented it to Pope John Paul II. Now, we had been coached in advance what to do when we approached the Holy Father, and that we could say a few words. So, of course, I was a bit nervous, and I was accompanying Brother Raphael of Marytown. And so the two of us went up 2 by 2 to the Holy Father during the presentation of gifts, and he looked first at Brother Raphael, and Brother Raphael was all flustered, and all he could manage to get out of his mouth was, "I'm Brother Raphael from America." Well, anyway, the Holy Father laughed a little bit and looked at me, and I had prepared what I wanted to say. I says, "Holy Father, I'm Father James from America. Please pray that we might all be as consecrated to Mary as Saint Maximilian Kolbe was." Well, he nodded his head a little, and he seemed to be taking in everything I said. He raised his hand as if to bless me, but instead of blessing me, he cupped it behind his ear and said what I heard as, "Huh." He hadn't heard me. And so 10 decibels louder, I hollered out, "Holy Father, please pray that all of us may be as consecrated to Mary as Father Maximilian Kolbe was." Well, now he did hear me, and he smiled ear to ear, and he looked at me. My heart was thumping, waiting to hear what His Holiness would say, and he pointed his finger right at me. Now, my mother taught us never to point, but the Holy Father hadn't heard Mother's lesson, so he said to me, "You do that." So by papal command, I was ordered to continue telling everyone how consecrated to Mary we should be in the spirit of Father Maximilian Kolbe. And that was my first encounter with John Paul the Great. The second happened 4 years later, 1986, when I was a delegate to the general chapter of our Franciscan order in Rome. And the custom at that time was that at the end of a general chapter, the Holy Father would meet with the 100 or so delegates. So this meeting that he had with the 100 or so of us took place actually at our Seraphic College in Rome, the Seraphicum, not at the Vatican. The Holy Father traveled out there, met with us, and we each had an opportunity to be introduced to him by our Minister General and to have a few private words. Now, before the general chapter had begun, in America, my sister's father-in-law had passed away, and his name was Joseph, and he was a French-Canadian carpenter. So whilst in Rome, at the time of the general chapter, I got a little statue of St. Joseph the Workman to bring back to my sister and brother-in-law in America. And this statue of St. Joseph the Workman I carried with me to this papal audience in 1986, and I asked the Holy Father if he would bless it in memory of Joseph Michaud, a carpenter. And only I made that question to him in Polish. I had practiced my Polish. I'm full-blooded Irish American, but I had practiced my Polish, so I spoke to him in Polish. And he looked at me with a querulous look on his face, and he said to me in English, "Are you Polish in origin?" And I answered him in Polish. I says, "Ojcze Święty, nie, Holy Father, no, ja jestem Irlandczykiem z Ameryki. I'm an Irish American, ale kocham Polskę, but I love Poland." Well, he smiled ear to ear, and he slapped me right in the face, a little love pat. And of course, he blessed the statue. Well, I was so thrilled with my papal love pat that when I got back to the seminary in America, I couldn't wait to tell Father Zeno. He was one of our elderly friars with whom I lived in the seminary. And Father Zeno had a heart of gold, but an exterior, he was a bit of a curmudgeon. So he looked at me, and he was from Poland and spoke broken English. And he looked at me and he said, he always called me Jimmy, "Jimmy, you think the Holy Father gave you a love pat. I know better. He slapped you in the mouth because your Polish is so bad." So I don't know to this day, and I'll have to wait to heaven to find out whether the Holy Father gave me a love pat or a slap in the mouth. Anyway, whatever it was, I was thrilled with it. Now, the third time I got to meet John Paul for words of conversation was in 1991. And again, I was in Rome for a meeting, and I had the invitation during that meeting to join a group of 80 Polish pilgrims who were having a private evening audience with the Holy Father. So I went with all these Polish pilgrims to the lovely hall within the Vatican where he was receiving us, and he went around the whole room and one by one greeted each one of us and spoke to us. And when he came to me, this time I spoke to him in English, I showed him this little miraculous medal that I had with a card with the prayer to Mary in Arabic. And I explained this was just around the time of the Gulf War, that I had sent one of those miraculous medals to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And he looked at me with this most puzzled look on his face, and he put his hand to his head as if to say, "You did what?" He didn't say that, but I presumed he was thinking that. Anyway, we had a lovely interchange. Now, the fourth visit occurred in 1992, and it was the start of 1992, and I had to be in Rome again for another meeting, and I had brought with me to Rome this gorgeous tapestry, hand-embroidered by the Carmelite nuns at the Hill of Tepeyac in Guadalupe, Mexico City. And it was a tapestry of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And we Franciscans had obtained this beautiful handcrafted embroidered tapestry of Our Lady of Guadalupe so that I could bring it around to as many as possible of our Franciscan churches in the year 1992 as we commemorated the 500th anniversary of the coming of the gospel to the Americas with Christopher Columbus. And I wanted to use it to demonstrate the Marian dimension of the evangelization of Americas. And particularly since Franciscans had accompanied Columbus on the second of his journeys to show that the Marian devotion of Franciscans was integral to the evangelization of the Americas. So I very much wanted to use this tapestry of Our Lady of Guadalupe as a tool for evangelizing. And I thought, what better way to let it be an effective instrument for our Marian evangelization than to ask the Pope to bless it. So boldly, I went to the Vatican one day while I was in Rome for those meetings in 1992, and I went to the office of the Pontifical Household, and there was, by the grace of God, there was the little brother on duty that day who chanced to be from Ireland, and we hit it off famously right away. And I told him, could I leave this image here with you for a few days, and somehow could you get it blessed by Pope John Paul, and I'll come back and collect it next week. And the brother took the image and says, would you wait here for a moment? And he went back into an office, and apparently he went to see his superior, which was Archbishop Monduzzi, I think it was. And he came back 15 minutes later. He said, Father James, it's all arranged. The Holy Father will bless this image of Our Lady tomorrow at noon, and you're invited. Well, I was gobsmacked. Who would have thought that a little nobody could walk in off the streets of Rome with an image to get blessed by the Pope and suddenly get invited to a private audience? But sure enough, the next day, an invitation arrived first thing in the morning, printed invitation inviting me to come to this audience with the Pope. And I said to the Irish Father Patrick, one of our elderly friars who was there with me, would you like to come with me? Now, we didn't know if he'd be able to get in on the audience or not, but he came, and when we came to the bronze doors and I showed the invitation to the Swiss guards, they saluted us and clicked their heels, and they let us in, and we got led through one courtyard, another courtyard. Finally, we were led into this gorgeous audience hall with nobody in it, but there, stretched on an easel, was the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. So Father Patrick positioned himself on one side of the easel, I on the other side, and shortly thereafter, in walked the Pope. And he came right up to the easel and looked at the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe before he even noticed Father Patrick and me, and he folded his hands and he bowed his head, and he just kept looking and looking at the image and praying. I felt like a peeping Thomas looking at someone having a love affair with the Blessed Mother, and there was the Pope, and there was his beloved Madonna. And after what seemed like minutes of prayer and contemplation of the image, the Holy Father turned to me, and that's when we started chatting, and I explained to him that the purpose of this image and our asking his blessing on it was so that we could use it as a tool in the Franciscan work of evangelizing for the 500th anniversary of Columbus and the coming of the Gospels to the Americas. And then he noticed that Father Patrick was wearing a gray habit and I was wearing a black habit. So he asked, why is he wearing gray and you wearing black? And we explained that in Great Britain and Ireland, the friars historically have been known as the Grey Friars. And so in Britain and Ireland, the friars wear gray habits. Other parts of the world too, now they also wear gray. And I said, well, I in the black habit, I guess you could call me the black sheep. So anyway, we laughed a little about that. He blessed us, blessed the image, and was gone. I thought about the fact that I had said I was the black sheep, and he had repeated the word sheep, and he's the shepherd looking after all of us sheep, whether we're gray or black or whatever types we are. And that was my fourth visit person to person with Pope John Paul II. Now, the fifth occurred in 1994. Again, I was doing some work in Rome, and the phone call came to me one day from the Pope's secretary inviting me to concelebrate the following morning at the Pope's private Mass in the private papal apartments in the Vatican. And so the next morning, I went and presented myself, and there was a group of about 30 priests who had been invited to have Mass with the Holy Father in English. And I suppose that's why I was invited, because I was one of the English-speaking priests in Rome. So we all got vested before we were led into the papal chapel. And when we all vested, were led into the papal chapel, the Pope was already there at his prie-dieu praying. And so it was utter silence. And by now, Pope John Paul II was getting older. And the first thing I noticed was that he groaned while he was praying. It was a hauntingly mystical kind of groaning that he was emitting while he was praying, deep sighs and groans. And again, all of us were caught up in this highly contemplative atmosphere. At that moment, I certainly had the strong sense that John Paul II was a contemplative. And then he started Mass, and was a powerfully prayed Mass. And it was then that I noticed that his left hand had a tremor in it, quite a noticeable tremor. And later I was told by one of the priests who works in the papal offices that it was an after effect of the shooting attempt in 1981. But subsequently, when he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, I recognized that that tremor was probably one of the early signs of the Parkinson's disease that would befell him eventually, and not deter him from his papal duties one iota, but would still be the great cross that he would have to suffer. So it was a privilege to experience John Paul II at the foot of the cross at that Mass. His groaning, the trembling of the hand, his union with Jesus offering the Mass, a powerful experience of the holiness of him as a priest united with Christ the High Priest. After the Mass, we were all invited into the Pope's library, and once again he met each of us individually. Now, I had carried with myself to that audience a small volume of the Pope's poems translated into English, Easter Vigil and other poems. So when he came to me, I thanked him for everything, but I says, "Holy Father, I've been reading your poems." And he was quite interested in the poems that I had read, and I told him, "I love your poem, The Quarry, especially where you talk about hands are the heart's landscape." And so I was a bit bold. I says, "Your Holiness, would you consider with your hands that once worked in the quarry signing my book?" And he said to me, "I write JP." So I could see perhaps he couldn't write well even standing up now because of the beginning of the tremors, but he wrote in my book JP. And afterwards I thought, well, these priestly hands of his that were anointed, that are now trembling, what a privilege that I've not only kissed his hand, his ring, at every one of these 5 encounters with him, but with that same hand he's even signed this book of his poems. There are many other instances that I could share with you, reminiscing about other times when I had the honor and privilege of being present in the same site as John Paul II. But I won't bore you with all those details. I'll simply make reference to his Mass overlooking the Sea of Galilee, and I was a concelebrant at that Mass in the Holy Land in the year 2000. And he proclaimed the Gospel from chapter 28 of Matthew at that Mass, and it's the Gospel that ends with, "And know that I am with you always until the end of the world." And I remembered that he had proclaimed that same gospel in 1979 when I gave out communion at his Mass in Grant Park in Chicago, Illinois. And at the same Mass in Chicago as now in 2000 at the Sea of Galilee, I thought to myself, well, here is the Vicar of Christ saying that Christ would be with us always to the end of the world. And he too, John Paul, spiritually as Christ's vicar, wanted to assure us of his presence in our lives always. And now, even though he's dead and elevated to the ranks of the saints in heaven, I have this strong sense of his presence still with me personally and with all of us collectively in the world. And I certainly hope and pray that all of you who've had the patience to listen to my reminiscence about John Paul the Great will also have a deeper appreciation that God lets the saints, like John Paul, continue to have an active presence in the life of the world. And may all of those great initiatives that he took during his papacy continue to find fruition in the world as we heed his example, as we ask his intercession, and as we give thanks to God for the greatness of this man who was elevated to walk in the shoes of Peter and to lead us all in the way of peace.